Good evening, all. Thank you for being with us tonight. We are, if you're going to turn to Ezra chapter 7, that's where we'll begin our journey tonight. Ezra chapter 7. If you have the workbook material, it's class 13. I do have a few extras of class 13 and 14 if anybody needs those. So this will be. I did such a good job helping Carol that she has extras too. 13 and 14. This is. There are a few more in the back. Was there one more? Can you see if you can fish us out of 13 to 14? Where are they? They're in that red box, but they're not in order. A 13 and a 14. So we'll be in class 13 tonight. When we began, we stood here together 1st of July and began in Ezra chapter 1, and we stand here now on the 1st of September. We're in Ezra chapter 7. It doesn't feel like that we have gone very far, but I think as we all know, we've taken a few detours on our path and covered some other books, Haggai and Zechariah and Esther, because they all kind of fit in this time frame. But now we're back to kind of where we started in some ways, back to the Book of Ezra, and we'll take this class and the next class and finish up the Book of Ezra, and then move right on to the Book of Nehemiah. So that'll be our plan of attack. 13 this class, 14 next class, and then I'll have some new worksheets for us on Sunday. So that will be our plan. Before we begin this evening, Jeff, do you mind to say a word of prayer for us?
Our Father, as we come to you at this time, we just want to thank you so much for this good day that you've given us today. We're just so very grateful that you have given us life into this day, and we just thank you so much for the blessings that we have. We thank you that you cared for us and watched over us. We're so grateful that you kept us well and safe at this time, Heavenly Father. We thank you that we have this hour of study here this evening. We're grateful for this opportunity. We pray you be with Michael and the other teachers this evening. Help them as they direct our thoughts as we study your word this evening. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So do we miss everybody on 13 now? Do we miss anybody? All good? So since it has been a while since we've been in Ezra, I wanted to take just a moment and do a little bit of recap. Just kind of, do we need one more? Jeff, we do need one more. Thank you. 13, please. Just do a little bit of recap on how we got here to chapter 7. Because again, we took some detours. But here, the narrative, it was Miss Wanda. The narrative of Ezra, if you remember, we began with Cyrus. Remember, that's how we kind of began our first class, with Cyrus back in 538 BC. And in chapter 1, that's how the book of Ezra starts, is with the Persian King Cyrus and this great proclamation. If you remember that proclamation that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, and with the purpose, the definite purpose of rebuilding the temple. It's kind of monumental thing that the Jews were allowed to return. So again, remember they'd been in captivity. Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar had taken most of the prominent Jews into captivity, but now this decree of Cyrus allows them to come back. And we met Zerubbabel, the governor, and the high priest Joshua in chapters 1 and 2. And there's about 42,000 that come back with that traveling party there in chapters 1 and 2. And then if you remember in chapter 3, we laid the foundation of the temple. We were making progress. And after about 2 years, there was a celebration. The foundation of the temple was laid. And there's also, the writer of Ezra gives us some details that building materials had been secured and that workers had been hired and that everything was in place to complete this construction of the temple. So we're about 536 BC now. In just a couple of years, we've made pretty good progress. And then in chapter 4, the progress kind of comes to a screeching halt. Remember, the adversaries oppose the work. The king of Persia says, we're just going to stop until I can figure out what's going on here. That seemed to be a good excuse for the children of Israel. And so all progress on construction stopped for about 16 years until Haggai and Zechariah, sent by God to kind of kick the people in the pants a little bit, spur them on to complete the work. So we in detail read those books of Haggai and Zechariah. So again, we're what, 18 years from the initial return, and in just a few years the temple is completed. Darius, remember, went back and looked at that decree from Cyrus and said, yeah, this all looks legit. We want this temple to be completed, and it was completed in 516 BC. So that's, any questions or comments about any of that? That's kind of a review of the last 2 months of where we've been. And you know, we looked in detail at Haggai and Zechariah, and then how Esther might fit in here as well. But this is what Ezra, the writer of Ezra, has recorded for us up to this point as we get to the beginning of chapter 7. And that temple was completed, and as we end chapter 6, we know that temple was completed about 516 BC. We know when that was. But we get to the very first phrase of Ezra chapter 7, and we've got a little bit of an issue, because at least in my version, and your version may read a little differently, it says, now after this, or after these events. And that's very vague, because depending on what commentary you read, that after this could be 1 year later, it could be 58 years later, it could be 117 years later. After this could mean a lot of different things. My goal tonight is not to get into the chronology of that, just to point out that there is a lot of difference of opinion about when Ezra really came on the scene. There is some evidence, I believe, that he came very soon after the completion of the temple, but there's also pretty good evidence that it could have been 60, I believe 117, but you can find that in some commentaries. But many people believe that he came 58 years later. And again, it just depends on which king we think we're talking about in Ezra chapter 7 and verse 1. So again, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole again. We've talked about that at some length. Which chronology you believe. The narrative of Ezra is exactly the same either way. The lessons are the same either way. But there's certainly some discrepancy about how big is the gap between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. And it's kind of one of these things that's debated among Bible scholars, is how big is that gap? Any thoughts or questions about that? I don't want to belabor it, but I just want to point out that there is a gap. We just don't know how big it is. Nobody wants to talk about that any more than I do. Okay, so with all of that groundwork, that's where we've been. Now we begin Ezra chapter 7, and this is really, the book is named Ezra, but this is the first time that we meet our key character in this book of Ezra, or at least who it's named after. I think we mentioned it could just as easily have been named Zerubbabel or Jeshua, but we finally meet Ezra in Ezra chapter 7. So, what qualifications did Ezra bring to his work in Jerusalem is the first question. And let me, maybe before we even answer that question, what was Ezra's role? What was his job? Why was he coming to Jerusalem? Threefold, Ezra says, or excuse me, Carol says. So give me all the folds.
He studied the law of God.
Yes?
He interprets the law of God, and he practiced the law of God.
So he studied, interpreted, and practiced the law of God. And he was a teacher. Yes. And I think we can learn from, I wrote the verse down, I've lost it, that his goal was to go up to teach the statutes and rules in Israel. That's verse 10. So we've got this temple completed now, but apparently we're not acting exactly right as far as what the rules and statutes are. And remember, it's not as easy as going to the corner bookstore and buying a new copy of the law to remind us of what those rules and statutes of the law of Moses are. Whether there was even a copy of the law of Moses in Jerusalem at this time it's not an absolute certainty that there was. That what was known by oral tradition and by the memory of the elders and by what was taught through the high priest. because it makes a big deal that Ezra in verse, where is it? Verse 14? That Ezra has the law of God, not just in his heart, not just in his head, but where? In his hand. So that's significant. Ezra had a physical, in a time when this is not a given that everybody's got one of these, Ezra has a physical copy of the law in his hand. I think that's significant. There, again, somewhat speculating, but we don't know if there was a copy of that law in Jerusalem. But Ezra brought one. He had a copy of it in his hand. So his job is to teach the law in Jerusalem. So, question is, what qualifications did he bring to that? Why was he qualified to do this? So Carol says first he's in the line of Aaron. That's true. We see that in verses 1 through 5. We see his lineage there. He's from the tribe of Aaron. He's from the tribe of priests. In fact, the king refers to him as a priest in verse 11. Okay, what else? He's a scribe. Okay, so we learn that in verse 6. In fact, my version says he's a skilled scribe. Does that just mean he has good penmanship? What does it mean to be a skilled scribe? An expert, yeah, an expert in the law. The probably closest translation or relative of the word scribe in our modern day would be what? You may know? What would we call a scribe in today's language? A lawyer, yeah. That's an expert in the law. He was. Think about what lawyers are trained to do in the law of the land. Ezra was trained to do that in the law of Moses, to know the ins and outs of the law, to be able to explain the law. Excuse me. Ezra could do that. He was a skilled scribe, a skilled and knowledgeable lawyer in the law of Moses. All right, what else? Yes. Yes, the Lord had given him this task. We do see that. The hand of the Lord was on him. Yeah, verse 6, thank you. The hand of the Lord was on him. Almost he was chosen for this task. He was appointed, he was chosen for this task in verse 6. You know, if you notice in verse 10, I think that kind of goes to Carol's point earlier. He had studied the law. He desired to do it and to teach it. That's pretty significant, right? It's one thing to desire to teach the law. It's another thing to desire to do it. Ezra desired to do both, to do it and to teach it.
Did Ezra take this upon himself? The king didn't send him, did he? Ezra took this upon himself to do
So Carol asked a very good question. Whose idea was this that Ezra should go to Jerusalem? Was this Artaxerxes' idea? Was this Ezra's idea? Whose idea was this?
Later in the chapter, the king's kindness, he attributes it to God.
Yes.
So this was, of course, God's doing.
Yes. There's some providence here.
That the king recognized the God, Ezra's God, the God of Israel, and so it's kind of both the king, but it's God, God through the king, if I understand.
Definitely providence that Ezra is getting to Jerusalem, no question. Does somebody else have another comment there?
Verse 6 says, the king granted him all his requests according to the hand of the Lord his God upon him.
So it's kind of hard to discern, but I think there is a combination there that Ezra requested some of these things. It certainly appears that Artaxerxes went above and beyond even what Ezra requested in making that trip as profitable and comfortable as possible. And obviously God's hand was in all of it. So I don't know if that answers your question, Carol, but whether God first put it in the heart of Artaxerxes or in the heart of Ezra, I'm not sure we can know for sure from this text. Verse 14 of chapter 7 gives a little bit about why he was sent. He's sent by the king and the 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of God in your hand. So trying to determine if they were following the law that was in his hand. So I think we touched on all those, but there's a few of Ezra's qualifications. We touched on this last point in an earlier class, but just by way of reminder, if you look at the lineage of the high priest, and you can see that in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, the lineage of the high priest exactly mirrors the lineage of Ezra as in Ezra chapter 7. The high priest being Jeshua earlier in the book of Ezra. Ezra and Jeshua are definitely related. Depending on how old or how long you think that gap was between chapter 6 and chapter 7, Ezra was either Jeshua's uncle or his cousin or his nephew, somewhere in that, depending on how old you think Ezra is, he's one of those three things to Jeshua because they have the same lineage up until their grandfather or Jeshua's grandfather. Again, how many generations are there for Ezra? You can't really determine exactly, but they're closely related. Cousin, uncle, nephew, somewhere in that range. Just again, give you an idea of the lineage that Ezra was from. Now, why did Ezra not come back with the first group of exiles? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Depend on the gap. If it's a 60-year gap, he may have been not born. He may have been a kid. If it's a 1-year gap, it's hard to know. But yeah, Carol, to that point, that's exactly right. We're not sure. We're not told. But we do know that now he is coming here in chapter 7. Any other thoughts or comments about Ezra and his preparation to leave?
I think that list of Chronicles, what I've looked at it so far, that seems to be very strong support for about a 60-year gap.
Okay.
So very likely Ezra was not born
Yeah, it could have been that he wasn't when that first group came. Yep. That's certainly possible. Anything else? All right, let's go to question number 2. Describe the generosity of the king towards Ezra. Anybody want to put that, before we look at the details, how would you describe it in your own words about how this king treated Ezra? Extremely, like absurdly generous, divinely generous. Hard to even imagine. Remember who the Jews were at this time. I mean, they were a people without a real nation. There's 40,000 of them that are, have gone back to Jerusalem to try to rebuild the temple, but they didn't really have any real nation. They were certainly under Persian rule, and they were scattered all over the empire. And who was Ezra to have any standing before the king? But the king not only allows him to take men from Babylon and take them to Jerusalem, but sends them with all this stuff. So let's talk about what all this stuff was. So give me some examples of the king's generosity. I got a few noted here in different verses.
One of the things I remember was he even gave him stuff, he gave him the animals or whatever for sacrifice.
Yes, including animals to take with him or to buy on the way, yes. If you start from the top in verse 13, what's just the very basic first level of generosity is what in verse 13?
Allowed anybody.
Anybody wants to go can go. First of all, imagine that. Hey, anybody wants to go can go. So anybody that wants to take this trip with Ezra is free to go. Verse 15. Silver and gold. From the king's treasury. We don't know, and then we also read, if you go on in verse 16, that He allowed him to raise money beyond that if he wanted to. You can go on a fundraising campaign through Babylon if you desire to do that. So we don't know the ratio of what the king gave him versus what Ezra just rounded up, but we are told later in chapter 8 how much total silver and gold Ezra took with him. Let's go over there real quick while we're thinking about it. In chapter 8, in verse 26, he's kind of doling out his treasure here. And how much goods are these men taking with them to Jerusalem? Let's look at the numbers with me. I weighed out into their hand 650 talents of silver and silver vessels worth 200 talents. Now that kind of washes over us because we don't really speak in that lingo. But everything that I'm able to find says a talent, especially a Babylonian talent, is 75 pounds, I think. How many pounds of silver did we have here? 850 talents times 75. Tara? No. she was told there would be no math. Somebody's got the calculator out. 850 times 75.
63,750.
So I was using the 650 of silver and then the silver vessels of 200 talents. So I was adding those together. What was that number again? 63,750 pounds of silver. 63,000 pounds of silver. First of all, what does it take to haul? How many tons is that? How many tons of silver across the desert to Jerusalem? I mean, just imagine that. And remember, we're going to read later, Ezra turned down armed guards. Like, he's hauling who knows how many millions of dollars worth of silver across this territory. I mean, it's when you put that in terms of actual pounds, just the luggage, you can't fly with that much weight in your luggage. Just the poundage is astronomical, and that's just the silver. Of gold, 100 talents. I can do that math. That's 70. Huh? You got that one? 7,500 pounds of gold. Okay, put that in perspective. That's 3, almost 4 tons of gold. Yes.
Michael has written in here, I don't know how accurate this is, and I think it's talking about the silver equals $3,484,800.
So based on some price of silver at some point, it was over $3 billion worth of silver. It's just mind-blowing. First of all, the generosity of the king, it's just staggering. And then just the logistics of how he haul a few hundred tons of precious metals through the desert. It's unbelievable. It really just staggers you. And then that's in addition to some other things that are listed there in in chapter 8. So when we talk about the generosity, I don't know what word you put on that. It is just divine. It was divinely given to Artaxerxes that it was incredibly important for him to fund this project in just an enormous way. And then, as if that wasn't enough, when you go to verse 20, we're still not done just the economics of this. What does he say additionally in verse 20? Again, this is in Artaxerxes' letter. Hey, anything else you need? That's a blank check. Anything else you need? Hey, you never know when you may have to pick up a few things on the way, and a few hundred tons of silver aren't enough. If you need anything else, it's yours. And if that wasn't enough, again, just economically, verse 21, what does he say? hey, if you get into a bad way, when you've made your trip and now you're on the other side of the Euphrates, you're in the province beyond the river. You know that you probably see that, or your version may read that a little differently. But hey, when you're in that province beyond the river, they got a treasury too. And if you need to stop at 7-Eleven for some snacks on your way, won't you? You can raid their treasury too. Verse 21. Whatever treasure is in the province beyond the river, whatever you need, let it be done with all diligence. And you say, hey, if you need up to 100 talents of silver from them, you get that too, up to 7,500 pounds of gold. If you need of silver. If you need another 3-4 tons of silver, you can just pick that up on the way from the province beyond the river. So, I probably should have put some kind of little graphic up here about how many tons that was. It's just a staggering, first of all, just weight, a staggering weight of precious metals. And then the value of that, just kind of mind-boggling.
There wasn't that many men that went.
That's the other part of this. Like, how much was this per person? Ezra goes to pains, and we'll talk about this in chapter 8, to divide this among some of the priests. But how many animals did each priest have to load this on them just to physically get it to Jerusalem? And how was every robber and ne'er-do-well between Babylon and Jerusalem not just chasing them down? It's the greatest. It could be in the greatest heist of all time. It's a couple of thousand men, but with billions of dollars. The hand of God was with them, and that is exactly what Ezra said. Again, the numbers kind of wash over us if you just read through this, but you spend a little time thinking about what this actually meant to this band of people, and why Ezra couldn't round up more Jews to go with him. That part I have a hard time with too. You're going to leave here with a few $1 billion worth of stuff, but you can't get anybody that wants to go with you. Like, this is going to be a pretty good trip, guys. We can do okay here. I don't think we're going to run out of gas. Anyway, staggering amount of money. If that wasn't enough, what else does the king offer in verse 24? Tax exemption. So, duty-free shop. So, not only am I going to send you with more money than you could possibly ever spend in all your lifetimes, but you're not going to have to pay taxes when you get there. If you are a priest or if you work in the temple, you are officially tax exempt in Persia. That's a big deal. How does the Persian Empire keep the gears running? Everybody's taxed. That tax goes back to the treasury, either in the province across the river or ultimately back to Susa or back to Babylon. And this group of priests and Levites is going to be tax exempt. I think that's very interesting. And then maybe the most fascinating part of all is in verse 25. What is beyond all the economics and beyond the tax exemption, what does the king give Ezra in verse 25? Essentially, Ezra's got all the governmental authority beyond the river also. And that governmental authority is based not only on the law of Persia, but on what? I mean, contemplate that. That this, yes, from this pagan king. This pagan king, a few thousand miles away from Jerusalem, has now instituted that Ezra, who is in his band, who are going to bring probably more wealth to Jerusalem than is already there, and he's going to give him the authority to appoint magistrates and judges. He's basically going to make him the governor of that area based on, did everybody keep the law of God as well as the law of Persia? It's unbelievable.
In verse 26 too, whoever doesn't obey the law of God is going to be judged with, or judgment's going to be executed on him for banishment, death, or confiscation of goods, imprisonment.
Yes. Strictly enforced is what is my version. Let judgment be strictly executed. again, what got into Artaxerxes?
And he's carrying this letter
Yes.
with him. Well, I wonder what the other people that are already there going about their daily lives are going to think about this guy walking in with this letter.
Good question. What do the Jews in Jerusalem
Unless the
think
rebel's gone,
think when
unless he's
Ezra
gone.
think when Ezra shows up? One, I mean, what do you think when somebody shows up with a few $1 billion? Like, you've probably got some level of respect just from that perspective. And then he's got this letter from the king that kind of puts him in charge. And it says specifically in verse 36, chapter 8, in verse 36, one of the things that is specifically mentioned is this letter is kind of handed to the local officials. How do you think they took it? I got a feeling someone probably didn't take it that well. So back to the question of what got into Artaxerxes here.
Look what he wants.
So that's a very interesting answer.
I've heard her king say 3 or 4 times already, I'll give you up to half the kingdom.
So this is one of the arguments that makes a ton of sense from a timeline perspective on, was Esther really the queen under Xerxes, she queen under somebody else? If we've got the names of some of these kings that, and they're somewhat interchangeable and we maybe not have them identified correctly, how much sense does it make if Ahasuerus, whoever Ahasuerus was in Esther, if Ahasuerus finds this unique queen that changes his life in Esther, who has this uncle named Mordecai, and then all of a sudden he has this strange affinity for the Jews. Like that seems to mesh. Okay, you want something really interesting? Let's go to Esther. Chapter 2 and verse 16. So I'm telling you the timelines don't mesh exactly here, but just notice how closely they are. Esther chapter 2, 16, 17. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, and the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor. We already know that Esther has won grace and favor with all the eunuchs and all the maids, and she's already proven herself very, very valuable. And we don't know how many times Ahasuerus met Esther before this particular meeting, but this is the one that kind of sealed the deal. But we know that in the 7th month, the 7th year of his reign, she becomes queen. 7th year of her reign. Okay, so now if you go back to Ezra chapter 7, in verse 7, when is Artaxerxes provoked to send Ezra with more money than he knows what to do with? It's in the 7th year of his reign. I don't know that those things are correlated, but it's pretty coincidental. Is there some possibility that it was Esther's influence that provoked the traveling of Ezra? That is not unlikely. The timeline seems to support that. And at least it makes some sense. I mean, why he would be so generous. Obviously, God can change hearts, but maybe God changed hearts, through the wiles of a woman. Wouldn't be the first time that that's ever happened in the history of earth. But there's some reason that the king became very friendly, had a large affinity for the Jews, and sent Ezra with just an astronomical sum of money to take back to Jerusalem to use in the rebuilding of the temple. So, other thoughts or comments there?
But he kind of asked for the blessing of God from all of this, too.
Yes.
For he and his son.
Yes, very well said. So Carol notes that this king, what reasoning does he give for giving all this money to Ezra? He says in verse 23 of chapter 7, so I'm back in Ezra, chapter 7 and verse 23, whatever is decreed by the God of heaven, let it be done in full for the house of the God of heaven, lest his wrath be against the realm of the king and his sons. he's trying to win favor, it appears, with the God of heaven through these actions. Isn't it interesting that throughout human history, God always has somebody on the inside with these pagan kings? Daniel was the advisor, right, of Nebuchadnezzar. That Esther is at the side of Ahasuerus. That Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king. That Ezra evidently has a very good relationship with whoever this king is. That God's people always have influence in these kingdoms is pretty interesting, even when the Israelites are in exile. Anything else there? There is some providence happening. I can't imagine being a Jew, not knowing what's going on, and all of a sudden 1,500 of my Jewish friends show up with more money than I've ever seen in my life. It's just got to be a phenomenal. I can imagine when they've been struggling. You can imagine what a phenomenal feeling that has to be. Okay, Tara. How many traveled with Ezra to Jerusalem? It's a little bit of a math question. You had to do a little bit of math. I think our answers will vary a little bit, but I think I wanted to get the point across of in general how big was the traveling party. So what kind of answers did we get? 1854. 1496. Men. I'll tell you the answer I got, and I am not saying this is right. I'm just, if you give an answer, you got to show your work. So I'm going to show my work. In verses 1 through 14, just verses 1 through 14, I got 1,514. So when Ezra goes, and I'm not saying I'm right here. That was how I did my math. And some of it was really hard to know if he was talking about the same group or different group. That's what I came up with from that, 1,514. And that's when he's going through of the sons. And is he including those sons, or is he just talking about describing? Yeah, it makes it difficult. And then we notice in verse 15, they're getting ready to leave with these, however many from the first group, let's say close to 1,500. And then what does Ezra notice? We don't have any Levites here. Why does that matter?
They do the work of the temple.
So we're going to try to teach the law of God as given in the law of Moses. It's going to require some Levites. That they have responsibilities in the temple, and we're looking around and we don't have any Levites. We should also note that if you go back to Ezra chapter 1, there's not very many Levites that are noted with that larger traveling party either. I don't know what that means. That was there just a shortage of Levites in general at this time? It's hard, not sure. But Ezra says we're going to have a hard time fulfilling the law of God when we go back here unless we find ourselves some Levites. And so that's what he goes about to do. And he sends men, verse 16, he sends, what I believe in verse 16, he sends men that are already with his group to go find some Levites. And they come back with some. Again, I'm not saying this is the right answer. I'm just showing my work. 258. And then you got to include Ezra, because I don't think he counted himself. So I added one for Ezra. And so I got a total of 1,773, but I am not. We're in the neighborhood. I think we're all in the neighborhood. That we're wrong the same. We're wrong together.
Michael,
Yes.
pointed out in this commentary that the Levites stayed in Babylon because they had it so easy.
Yes. Yeah.
There was no temple there.
Could it have? They didn't have to work. Yeah, that's maybe fair. Carol noted that the Levites kind of like it in Babylon. There's no temple to work. They know if they have to go back to Jerusalem, there is a temple to work. That may be the case. In any case, we've got about 1,700, 1,800 men that are traveling with Ezra. Is it only men?
Yeah, there's women.
How do we know?
Because in some places he said our little ones.
Yep.
We're going to pass, so the Lord will make a safe trip for us and our little.
Very good. That's verse 21.
Ourselves and our children.
Yes, ourselves and our children, which certainly seems to indicate that there's going to be children on the journey. I think it doesn't take much imagination to say that there's women also. And so how many total are on the journey? It's hard to, it would be very difficult to know, but, you know, in a few thousands, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people. How does this compare? How does this compare to the group that came with Zerubbabel? Much smaller. Yeah. Zerubbabel came with 42,000. Ezra's got, let's say 5,000, just to pick a round number, about 5,000. And by the way, the Zerubbabel was only 42,000 men, so it likely was many more than that, maybe 100,000. Ezra's 5,000, so a much smaller group.
Just the math would say that number of men is $30 billion. 70 million people.
Spoken like an accountant. So if there's a few $billion and 1,800 men, how much is that per person? Pretty phenomenal.
Trip back.
Yeah. Well, Ezra's got a lot of clout.
Yeah. Does Ezra have a lot of clout when he walks into Jerusalem? Absolutely. And how much care did Ezra take? Now does that help us I'm going to skip ahead a question. How does that help us understand why Ezra took so much care in handling these possessions? How much temptation would there have been if you got $30 billion that you're taking back to Jerusalem? I mean, what's a few 100,000, right? Wouldn't that be a very human mindset? Look, we got 500 tons of silver. If I take a few pounds, nobody gonna notice. And that would be a very human thing to think. And so, what did Ezra do to try to alleviate that concern in chapter 8? He divided it out. Yep, divided it out among the high priests. By the way, think about how much that was per person. Phenomenal. And then what beyond that?
Made each one responsible for their portion.
So everyone was responsible for their portion. And how did he make them responsible for it? It says very specifically that
They wrote it down.
they weighed it. Yeah. So very specifically, for each of those individual portions, they weighed it on the front end, recorded it, and then they weighed it on the back end and recorded it. Ezra would have been a very good logistics guy. I mean, this is what happens with freight today, right? That's what happens to the freight that comes into our building. That when it's loaded, there is some document that notes here's what's loaded, and then when it's unloaded, there's some document that signs that yeah, we unloaded these things. And then you take both those documents back to the king and say, King, here's what we started with, and here's what we signed for in Jerusalem, and we're all square here. All $30 billion that you sent to Jerusalem made it, and we didn't lose a penny of it. You think that would be pretty impressive to the king of Persia? I think that weighing and that recording, Ezra would have been a good accountant. That weighing and that recording, I think, not only had a purpose to keep his people pure and accountable, but also accountability for the king to prove that these things were handled appropriately. With no army to protect him. So let's go back to question 4. What did Ezra reject? Of everything that the king gave him, he rejected or refused one thing. And that's in chapter 8, in verse 22. Depending on your version, it says some versions seem to indicate that he refused this. Others seem to say that he was afraid to ask for it. Yeah,
That's the way mine reads.
says he was afraid to ask for it.
Ashamed to ask.
Yeah, so that question may have been confusing.
Our God
Yes,
will be our protection.
yes.
I was ashamed. Turn around and say, oh, by the way, will you give
God will protect us, but if we had a legion, that wouldn't be terrible either. But how much faith did Ezra have to have now that we've kind of wrapped our heads around what he's traveling with? How much faith did he have to do this without any armed protection? I mean, that's completely phenomenal.
Fasted and prayed for 3 days.
Yes. So that's in, before they left, verse 21, a fast there by the river Ahava. By the way, if you did any research on that, a little unclear where that is, probably a few miles out of Babylon. So this journey started a little bit, and then they looked around, they didn't have any Levites, so they stopped there by the river Ahava. And that's where they proclaimed a fast and prayed for 3 days, prayed for a safe journey. So the faith of Ezra is one thing, What about the faith of the other 1,800 men with him? Like, Ezra, are you really, really, really sure you don't want to ask the king for, some cavalry here? But all of these people that went back to Jerusalem, how much faith they had to have to take this much treasure, not to steal a penny of it, and to put it all in the Lord's treasure when they got back to Jerusalem. Because remember, this wasn't for they could go back and get something nice for their families. All this went to the Lord's house in Jerusalem, and it all made it. That is some serious accountability in faith. So we will begin on class 14 next time and talk about what did Ezra find when he arrived back to Jerusalem. So we're at this kind of triumphant point, and as tends to happen with the children of Israel, every time we get to a high point, we run into some issues, and we definitely see that with Ezra.